The station was never quiet. Even in the early hours, when most of the delegates were still in their quarters, the Vielthari Conclave Station hummed with the sound of recycled air moving through long metal corridors, distant machinery turning somewhere deep in its walls, and the soft clicking of automated lights adjusting to the artificial morning cycle. It was a big place. Old, too. The kind of old that made new arrivals stop in the main corridor and look up at the ceiling and feel very small. Lyra had stopped doing that a long time ago. She had been a junior diplomat for the Vielthari for 3 years now, and she knew this station the way she knew her own hands. Every corner, every shortcut, every room that smelled slightly strange because of the ventilation problem nobody had fixed since before she was born. She walked fast, her long silver-threaded coat brushing the floor, a flat data board tucked under one arm. She was late for the forum session, which was not something she liked to be. Being late meant walking into a room where people were already seated, and seated people always looked up, and looking up meant they saw you, and being seen arriving late was not a good way to start a session that was already going to be long and dull. The main forum hall was a wide, circular room with tiered seating arranged in a ring around a central speaking floor. Every species that held membership in the conclave had a section, and every section was divided by rank. Senior delegates at the front, junior delegates at the back. By the time Lyra pushed through the side door and looked around for a seat, the room was almost completely full. She could see her group from the door. The Vielthari junior row was packed, every chair taken, every chair except one. She saw it immediately, and felt her stomach drop a little. The empty seat was at the far end of the row, separated from the rest of the Vielthari section by a small gap. The kind of gap that appears naturally when nobody wants to sit too close to something. The something in this case was the human delegate. He was sitting completely alone. He was a man of average height and average build, with short brown hair and a plain gray jacket that looked slightly too casual for the room. He was not looking around or trying to catch anyone's eye. He was not on a data device. He was eating, actually eating, right there in the forum hall, something small and wrapped in crinkled silver paper, unwrapping it with the calm focus of someone who had decided the food was the most important thing happening right now. From the row ahead, Lyra heard a low sound, the Vielthari version of a laugh, shaped in the throat rather than the mouth. She looked over and saw Sovex watching her. Sovex was an elder diplomat, old enough that the silver threading in his skin had faded almost to white. He had a long face and small sharp eyes, and the permanent expression of someone who found most things mildly disappointing. He was looking at her, then at the empty seat, then back at her. His gill flaps moved in a slow, deliberate way that meant he was amused. "It seems," he said, in the low tonal clicks of their shared language, "that there is one seat available." The two delegates beside him turned to look, then two more. A few quiet sounds passed between them. Not quite laughing, but close enough. They all knew what the open seat meant. Sitting beside the human was not something any of them chose to do. Not because of any official rule, just because it was not done. The human had been sitting in that same spot for 2 years, every forum session, and nobody had ever sat next to him. It was simply the way things were, and challenging the way things were took more energy than most junior diplomats were willing to spend. Sovex raised one narrow eyebrow. The dare did not need to be spoken aloud. Lyra held his gaze for 1 second. Then she lifted her chin, tucked her databoard more firmly under her arm, and walked across the room. She sat down next to the human with the steady, unhurried movement of someone who had chosen to be exactly where they were. She did not look at him. She set her databoard on her knee and opened the session file and stared at it with the kind of focus that was really just a performance of focus, the kind that meant she was very aware of everything around her while pretending to be aware of nothing. "Hey," the human said. She did not respond. "I'm Cole," he said. She still did not respond. Not out of cruelty. Vialthari junior diplomats simply did not initiate casual conversation during a session. It was not protocol. She had a very good reason to say nothing, and she was going to keep saying nothing for the entire session, and that would be the end of it. Then the forum began. The first item on the agenda was a trade dispute between the Harathi Collective and the Meccan Sovereignty. Lyra had seen this dispute on the agenda 4 times in the past year. It was one of those conflicts that never actually ended. It just changed shape every few cycles, got argued over, got temporarily shelved, and then came back again slightly different. Most of the junior delegates settled back in their seats when it was announced. Even some of the senior delegates looked like they were preparing to think about something else. Lyra opened the dispute file on her data board and began reading the summary she had already read twice before. Then she noticed movement beside her. Cole had put away the crinkled wrapper and was now holding a flat paper pad, actual paper, which was unusual enough on its own, and a small thin writing tool. He was not looking at a screen. He was watching the speaking floor, and as the Harathi lead delegate began the opening statement, Cole started writing. Small, fast, neat lines of text moving across the paper. She could not read it from the angle she was at. She tried not to look. She looked anyway. It was not notes. It was a diagram. Lines and branches spreading across the page, with small words written at each point. She could only catch pieces, but what she saw looked like some kind of map of the argument. Not just what was being said, but arrows pointing forward, options branching off, small numbers written in the margins. She pulled her eyes back to her data board. 30 seconds later she looked again. Cole had added another branch to the diagram. He was writing something in the bottom corner, very small, underlining it once. Without looking up from the page, he tilted the pad slightly toward her, just a few degrees, enough. "The Meccan are going to concede in about 6 minutes, he said, his voice low and level, like he was commenting on the weather. They always do on the third counteroffer. They just need it to look like they held out long enough." Lyra said nothing. She looked at her data board. She looked at the speaking floor. She counted without meaning to. 6 minutes later, the Meccan lead delegate raised one arm in the specific gesture that meant formal concession. She kept her eyes forward and her expression flat, and her hands very still on the data board in her lap. But something had shifted. She could feel it. A small, quiet crack in the version of this room she had walked into. The one where the human at the end of the row was a joke, a bit of easy laughter among colleagues. Nobody worth a second thought. That version of the room was already starting to feel less accurate than it had 10 minutes ago. She did not look at Cole again for the rest of the session, but she also did not stop thinking about what he had said. She sat next to the human, as a joke, and triggered something wild. Part 2. Lyra filed her session report that evening in 11 minutes. She had done it so many times that her hands moved through the process without needing her brain to be fully present. Summary of agenda items, notes on outcomes, observations on delegate conduct. Submit, done. She closed the report screen and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of her quarters, where the low blue light of the observation window was painting slow shapes across the metal panels above her head. She should have been tired. The session had run long, and the recycled air in the forum hall always gave her a faint headache by the 3rd hour. But she was not tired. She was thinking, which was a different thing entirely, and considerably less restful. She kept coming back to the same moment. The human had said 6 minutes, and then it had been 6 minutes, and then the Meccan delegate had raised his arm, and it was over. That was the part she could not set down and walk away from. Not because a prediction had been correct. Anyone with enough experience could make reasonable guesses in a forum session, but because of the way he had said it. No hesitation, no framing it as a possibility or a guess. He had said it the way someone states a fact they already know, the way Lyra might say the corridor lights come on at the 6th hour, because she had seen them do it 1,000 times. That kind of certainty had to come from somewhere. She sat forward and opened her personal research terminal. She told herself she was just going to look at his basic record. Public information. The kind of background file the conclave maintained on every registered delegate. Even the non-voting ones. She would read it, satisfy the small nagging curiosity in the back of her head, and then go to sleep. His name was Cole Avery, age 34 by human counting. His listed occupation was conflict analyst and historian, which was a combination that the Veilthari classification system had apparently not known what to do with, because his rank in the conclave registry was simply listed as observer, non-voting, pending formal review. Lyra looked at the date on the pending review. It had been pending for 2 years. 2 years. She read further. Before the conclave posting, Cole had spent 14 years working independently, studying negotiation patterns across 7 different species, not from translated summaries, but from raw, unedited recordings. He had learned to read tonal shifts in Veilthari speech. He had documented physiological stress responses in Harathi delegates during high-pressure sessions. He had cross-referenced historical forum outcomes against the specific language choices made in the opening statements of each dispute, going back 40 years. Lyra stopped reading and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she went back and read that last part again. She scrolled to the bottom of the public file. There was a line at the end that almost looked like an afterthought. The kind of detail that gets added to a record because the form requires something in that field, rather than because anyone thought it mattered. It said, submitted reports, internal archive, total count 47. 47 reports. She opened the archive search and typed in his name. The reports were there, all 47 of them, lined up in a neat column by date. The oldest going back almost exactly 2 years, and the most recent filed just 3 weeks ago. Every single one of them had the same small icon beside it, a gray circle that meant the file had never been opened by anyone in the recipient list. Not one, not a single report out of 47 had been read. Lyra sat very still for a moment. The blue light from the observation window moved across the wall beside her desk. Outside, through the thick glass, the stars did not move at all. She opened the first report. The writing was plain and direct. No formal Veilthari phrasing structures, no elaborate framing, no ceremonial opening acknowledgments. Cole simply started with what he had observed, explained how he had reached his conclusions, and then stated what he believed would happen next as a result. The subject was a water rights dispute between 2 minor species that had been on the forum agenda the week of his arrival. The report was 6 pages long, and it was, Lyra realized by the second page, one of the most clearly reasoned documents she had read in 3 years of diplomatic work. She got to the last page. Cole had written 4 predictions about how the dispute would develop over the following month. She cross-referenced them against the actual recorded outcomes in the forum archive. He had been right about all 4. She opened the second report. This one was about the way the Veilthari senior panel structured its speaking order during contested sessions, and how that structure, which had been established by tradition rather than by any written rule, consistently gave certain species less time to fully present their positions, which meant those species almost always entered negotiation from a weaker starting point, regardless of the actual strength of their case. Cole had laid it out methodically, example by example. Going back through session recordings she recognized from her own early training observations. He had not been angry about it in the writing. He had not accused anyone of anything deliberate. He had just shown, very clearly, what was happening and what it was producing. Lyra read to the end. Then she sat back and pressed her fingertips together, and thought about the 4 senior delegates she knew personally who had been running that speaking order for decades, and whether any of them had ever once questioned why the outcomes looked the way they did. She opened the third report. By the time she finished the fifth report, she had stopped telling herself she would just read one more and then stop. She had pulled a second screen open beside the first so she could keep the archive list visible while she read. The room outside her observation window had shifted from deep blue to the early gray of the station's artificial dawn cycle, which meant she had been sitting at her desk for most of the night without noticing. The reports built on each other. That was the thing she had not expected. Each one was complete on its own, but reading them in order was like watching someone construct a building. Every new document added a floor to something that was already standing. And by the time she reached the 15th report, she could see the shape of what Cole had been building across 2 years of sitting alone at the end of a row where nobody spoke to him. It was not just a collection of observations. It was a complete picture of everything that was quietly broken about the forum. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that made headlines or caused obvious crises, but in the slow, grinding way that keeps problems alive and recycling endlessly instead of ever actually getting resolved. She reached the 22nd report and had to stand up and walk to the window and just look at the stars for a while, because the 22nd report was about the translation matrix. She had not read it fully yet. She had only read the first 2 pages, just enough to understand what Cole was saying. But what he was saying in those 2 pages was the kind of thing that, once understood, could not be ununderstood. It sat in the mind and changed the shape of everything around it. She went back to her desk. She kept reading. Outside the window, the station's lights shifted from gray to the pale amber of morning. And somewhere down the corridor, the first automated food dispensers clicked on for the day cycle. And Lyra did not notice any of it. She was on report 31, and she was not even close to stopping. She sat next to the human as a joke, and triggered something wild. Part 3. Lyra finished the last report at some point in the early morning hours when the station was at its quietest. She closed the final page, set her data board flat on the desk, and did not move for a long time. The observation window had shifted from the pale amber of early morning to the full white light of the day cycle. She had been sitting at that desk for the entire night. Her tea, which she had made sometime around the 12th report, was cold and untouched beside her elbow. She looked at the archive list on her second screen. 47 gray circles, every single one of them meaning the same thing. Unopened, unread, unseen. 2 years of careful, patient, precise work, sitting in a folder that nobody had ever clicked on because it came from a human in the wrong format through the wrong channel. And the people who received it had simply moved on to the next item in their queue without a second thought. She thought about Cole eating his food in that crinkled wrapper, sitting alone at the end of the row, watching the forum session with that quiet, attentive look. She thought about how unbothered he had seemed, how he had tilted his paper pad toward her without being asked, just because she had been looking. She thought about what it would feel like to do that much work and have nobody notice for 2 years, and whether she would have kept going. She was not entirely sure she would have. She stood up, straightened her coat, and made a decision. The first thing she did was compile all 47 reports into a single document. It took her about 20 minutes, organizing them in order, making sure the dates were correct and the pages ran cleanly from one report to the next. When she was finished, the compiled document was long, very long. The kind of long that in diplomatic circles usually meant nobody was going to read it willingly. But she was not building it for a comfortable afternoon read. She was building it so that the full shape of what Cole had seen could not be missed, could not be broken up and dismissed piece by piece the way individual reports could be dismissed. All of it together was different from any one part alone. She knew exactly who needed to see it. Sovex had his office on the 4th level of the senior wing, in the part of the station where the corridors were wider, and the lighting was warmer, and the air somehow smelled less like recycled metal. He was already at his desk when Lyra arrived, which did not surprise her. Sovex had always arrived before everyone else. It was one of the things she had always quietly respected about him, even when he irritated her. He looked up when she came in. He took in the fact that she had clearly not slept, the flat data board in her hand, and the particular expression on her face that she was not entirely managing to keep neutral. He said nothing. He just waited. She placed the compiled document on his desk and stepped back. "The human delegate," she said. "Cole Avery. He has been filing reports to the senior archive for 2 years, 47 of them. None of them have been opened." Sovex looked at the data board. He did not pick it up yet. "I have read all of them," Lyra said. "I read them last night." There was a pause. Sovex had very good control of his expressions, better than almost anyone she knew. But something moved behind his eyes when she said all of them. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite discomfort, but lived somewhere between the two. He picked up the data board. She watched him read the summary page she had written at the front. His eyes moved slowly and steadily across the text. Then he went to the first full report and began reading that too. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the faint mechanical breath of the air system in the wall. He read without stopping for a long time. When he got to the section on the translation matrix, his hand slowed down. The finger he used to scroll the page stopped moving for a moment, and he went back and read something again, and then continued. His gill flaps, which usually moved in a slow, regular rhythm, went very still. He set the databoard down. He did not look at Lyra. He turned his chair slightly toward the viewport behind his desk, and looked out at the open space beyond the station's docking arms. A cargo transport was moving in slow silence past the far side of the viewport, its running lights blinking in the patient, indifferent way that machines blink when nobody is watching them. "How long has this been sitting in the archive?" he said. His voice was even, careful. 2 years, Lyra said. The first report was filed 8 days after his arrival. Sovex was quiet for a moment. The cargo transport drifted out of the viewport's frame and was gone. "The translation matrix," he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man saying something out loud to hear how it sounded in the open air. "The Horathi have been reopening settled disputes for 60 years, Lyra said. According to his analysis, they were never actually agreeing to what our matrix recorded them as agreeing to. The tonal cluster our matrix uses to indicate permanent resolution does not exist in standard Horathi diplomatic language. Every treaty that passed through our translation system carried a meaning on our side that was never present on theirs." Sovex did not respond immediately. A long silence passed through the room. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of a very large and very old institution, beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to understand something about itself that it would have been much more comfortable not knowing. "And the structural issues," Sovex said, "the speaking order, the arbitration cycling, all documented, with examples, going back 40 years in some cases." Sovex turned back from the viewport. He looked at the databoard on his desk. Then, he looked at Lyra, and for the first time since she had known him, Elder Sovex looked something close to uncertain. "You said none of these were opened," he said. "Not one," she said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Set up a meeting, not the junior review committee. The full senior panel." He paused. "And contact the human. Ask him if he is willing to present his findings to the panel directly." Lyra nodded and turned to leave. "Lyra," Sovex said. She stopped. "You read all 47 last night," he said. "It was not quite a question." "Yes," she said. He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the data board on his desk. "Then you had better go get some sleep before the meeting," he said. "You are going to want to be awake for it." She walked back down the long corridor toward the junior wing. The station was fully alive around her now. Delegates moving between offices, translation drones drifting at ceiling height, the distant sound of the forum hall being prepared for the afternoon session. Everything looked the same as it always did. But she was already seeing it differently. She found Cole in the junior delegates' common room, sitting at a corner table, with his paper pad open beside an actual printed map of something, a small cup of whatever humans drank in the morning in his hand. The same quiet and unbothered look on his face as always. She stopped at the edge of his table. "Cole," she said. He looked up. "The full senior panel would like to meet with you," she said. "They want to hear your findings directly." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his paper pad. Then he looked back at her. And there was something in his face that was not quite surprise, but was something honest and unguarded, that passed quickly, before he put a small, calm expression back in its place. "Should I bring my notes?" he said. "Bring everything," she said. He nodded once and looked back down at the map on the table, and his hand moved to his paper pad, and he turned to a fresh page and began writing something down. Already preparing, already thinking ahead, the same way he had been thinking ahead for 2 years in a room where nobody had been paying attention. Lyra turned and walked away to find an empty room where she could sleep for 2 hours before everything changed. She sat next to the human as a joke and triggered something wild. Part 4. The senior panel meeting room was on the top level of the station, in a part of the building that most junior delegates never had a reason to visit. The corridor leading to it was lined with old carved panels showing the founding species of the conclave in formal poses, each one looking out at the viewer with the kind of expression that was meant to communicate wisdom and permanence. The room itself was large and oval-shaped, with a long, dark table running down the center, and high-backed chairs arranged along both sides. Everything in it was designed to feel serious, important, settled. Cole walked in carrying his paper pad, a small case with printed documents, and a portable flat screen he had borrowed from the junior delegates' resource room. He was wearing the same plain gray jacket he always wore. He looked around the room once, found a good spot near the center of the table, where his screen would be visible from both sides, and began setting up without waiting to be told where to sit. Lyra stood near the door and watched the senior panel members file in. There were 9 of them. She had seen all of them from a distance many times, but had never been in a room this small with them all at once. Elder Dressa arrived last. She was the oldest member of the panel, old enough that the silver threading in her skin had gone completely white, and the movement of her hands was slow and deliberate, in the way that came not from weakness, but from a very long habit of doing nothing in a hurry. She looked at Cole once as she took her seat, a long, steady look, and then folded her hands on the table and waited. "I will try to be clear and not waste any of it." Nobody responded to that. A few panel members exchanged a brief look. He started with the forum's arbitration cycle. He put a simple diagram on his flat screen, just lines and boxes, nothing complicated, and walked through how disputes entered the system, how they were argued, how they were resolved, and how they came back. He spoke without rushing and without the elaborate formal structures that Veilthari diplomatic speech required. He just talked. Plain words, in plain order. When he wanted to make a point, he made it, and then moved on. By the end of the first 20 minutes, 2 of the panel members who had started the meeting leaning back in their chairs were leaning forward. He moved to the speaking order problem. He had printed copies of his analysis, and he slid them down the table so each panel member had one to follow along with. He walked through the examples slowly, one by one, showing how certain species consistently received fewer speaking rotations in contested sessions, and what that did to the outcomes over time. One of the senior panel members, a Velthari named Corvin, who had been managing session logistics for 30 years, started to say something twice, and stopped himself twice, before finally staying quiet and reading the page in front of him instead. Then, Cole got to the translation matrix. He paused before starting that section. Not a long pause, just a breath, the kind that meant he understood what he was about to put in the room, and was giving it the appropriate moment before he did. He pulled up a second diagram. This one showed two columns side by side. On the left was the tonal structure of the specific Velthari phrase cluster the translation matrix used to indicate permanent resolution in formal treaty language. On the right was the corresponding structure in standard Harathi diplomatic speech. The gap between them was marked in the diagram with a simple line and a short label that said, "Does not exist in source language." He explained it the same way he had explained everything else. Plainly, without drama. The Velthari phrase carried a sense of total and permanent closure. It was the kind of language used when something was finished for good, and all parties understood it was finished for good. The Harathi equivalent, closest to it in meaning, was used only in the context of death, the ending of a life, not the ending of a dispute. In standard Harathi diplomatic language, the concept of a permanent and total resolution to a living, ongoing relationship between two groups simply did not exist. Disputes were expected to be revisited. It was their entire framework for how agreements between groups worked. Every treaty the Harathi had signed through the standard Velthari translation matrix for 60 years had told them in language they recognized that something had ended. They had kept coming back to the forum because from their side, nothing had ended. Nothing could end. That was not how their world worked. And from the Velthari side, every return looked like bad faith. The room was very quiet. Elder Dressa had not moved since Cole put the diagram on the screen. Her hands were still folded on the table. Her eyes were on the two columns. After a long moment, she reached out and picked up the printed page in front of her and looked at it more closely, the way a person looks at something when they are hoping that a closer look will show them they misunderstood. It did not show her that. She set the page down. "We authored that matrix," she said. "Yes," Cole said. "We considered it definitive." "I understand that," Cole said. "I think the gap is not in the quality of the work. I think it is in the consultation process. The Harathi were not included when the matrix was originally built. The Velthari language team worked for recorded samples and secondary translations. There was no direct review from Harathi linguists at any stage." Dressa looked at him steadily. "How did you find this?" Cole was quiet for just a second. "I had a lot of time," he said, "and the session recordings go back a long way. Once I started looking at the Harathi return pattern, the language question was the only explanation that fit all the cases cleanly." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Corvin, the logistics manager who had stopped himself from speaking twice earlier, said quietly, "The military vote. 6 months ago. The Harathi border dispute." Cole nodded. "That was in Report 31, he said. Another silence passed through the room. This one had a different weight to it than the silences before. It was the kind of silence that comes when a group of people all understand the same thing at the same time, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. That vote had come within a single ballot of authorizing military action against the Harathi collective. It had been presented as a response to continued bad faith negotiations. Every person in this room had read the briefing documents that framed it that way. Several of the people in this room had voted on it. Cole did not say any of that. He did not need to. After the session ended and the panel members filed out slowly in small, quiet groups, Lyra walked alongside Cole down the long corridor back toward the main station levels. The carved panels on the walls passed them in silence. The founding species looked out from their formal poses, permanent and settled, the same way they always had. "You knew," Lyra said. "You knew all of this for 2 years. You filed the reports. You knew no one was reading them." Cole walked for a moment without answering. "Yeah," he said, "pretty much. And you kept writing them anyway." "The work still needed doing," he said simply, "whether or not anyone was watching." She walked beside him and thought about that. And the more she thought about it, the less simple it seemed, even though he had said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Behind them, back in the oval room on the top level, Elder Dressa was still sitting at the long dark table, with the printed page in her hands, reading the 2 columns on the translation diagram one more time, alone in the room that was designed to feel settled and permanent, which tonight felt like neither of those things. She sat next to the human as a joke, and triggered something wild. Part 5. The station changed after that meeting. Not loudly. Not all at once. It changed the way water changes the shape of a rock. Slowly, steadily, in a direction that only becomes obvious once you step back and look at the whole thing from a distance. The first thing that happened was the translation matrix review. Elder Dressa flagged it for emergency status the morning after Cole's presentation, which meant it bypassed the standard committee waiting period and went directly to active review. A team of language specialists was pulled together within 48 hours. For the first time in the Matrix's 60-year history, the review team included delegates from every species whose languages were represented in the system. That had never been done before. Nobody had ever thought to do it before. Or perhaps more honestly, nobody had ever pushed hard enough to make it happen. The second thing that happened was Cole's reassignment. Dressa handled it personally, which was unusual for something that was technically an administrative matter. The Veilthari bureaucratic system did not have a category for what Cole was, which meant placing him in a formal advisory role required either waiting for a new category to be created through the standard approval process, which would take several months at minimum, or having someone senior enough simply decide that the role existed and act accordingly. Dressa chose the second option. She signed the reassignment herself on a plain authorization form and sent it through without waiting for anyone to debate it. There were people who objected. 2 senior panel members filed formal complaints, arguing that the forum's foundational structure was being undermined by rushing changes through outside the proper process. Their complaints were logged, acknowledged, and set aside. Dressa did not argue with them. She simply continued moving. Cole moved out of the junior delegates row and into a small office on the 3rd level that had been used for storage for the past several years. He cleaned it out himself over the course of one afternoon, stacking old equipment crates in the corridor for the maintenance team to collect. When Lyra passed by and looked in, he had already set up his paper pad on the desk and was sitting in his chair with the comfortable, settled look of someone who had been working in a place for years rather than hours. The third thing that happened was Paige Dunbar. Lyra had not known about Paige Dunbar until Cole mentioned her name casually during one of the Translation Matrix review meetings, when the team lead asked if anyone had contacts with expertise in cross-species linguistic gap analysis. Cole said he had been corresponding with a human linguist on that specific subject for about 18 months, and that she had already developed a partial framework for exactly the kind of structural gap the Matrix was showing. He said it the same way he said most things, plainly, without making it into a larger moment than it was. The team lead asked him to reach out to her. Paige Dunbar arrived on the station 12 days later, with 3 colleagues and enough printed reference material to fill a cargo bay. She was tall and direct, and spoke 4 languages besides her own, and she walked into the Matrix review room on her first day and started asking questions that made 2 of the senior language specialists go very quiet and start pulling up files they had not looked at in years. Within a week, she had become the operational center of the entire review process. People stopped talking when she walked in, not out of deference exactly, but out of the particular attention that good rooms give to someone who clearly knows what they are doing. Cole and Paige worked well together, in the easy, efficient way of people who have been exchanging ideas long enough to skip the part where you explain your reasoning from the beginning. Lyra observed this from a distance at first, and then from closer up as the weeks passed and her own role shifted naturally toward the review work that was now the most important thing happening on the station. The Harathi situation moved faster than anyone had expected. Once the corrected translation framework was formally drafted and submitted to both sides, the Harathi Diplomatic Council requested an immediate renegotiation session. The request came through in language that the new translation framework rendered clearly for the first time. Not aggressive, not demanding, just direct and relieved in the particular way that Harathi expressed the end of a long confusion. The renegotiation session was held 3 weeks after Cole's presentation to the senior panel. Lyra attended as part of the supporting delegation. She sat in the second row and watched the Harathi lead delegate, a being named Verath, who had 6 arms and a recorded lifespan of over 400 years, sit down across the table from the Vailthari senior panel and receive the corrected version of the original treaty document. Verath read it slowly. The room was very quiet. When Verath finished reading, he sat completely still for almost a full minute, in the way that Harathi express something they feel deeply, but do not put into immediate words. Then he looked across the table and said, in his own language, through the new translation framework, something that rendered in Vailthari as, "We have been trying to say this for a very long time." Dressa, sitting at the head of the Vailthari side of the table, said, "We understand that now. It was not the end of everything. Real resolution between two groups who have been talking past each other for 60 years does not happen in a single afternoon. There were more sessions after that, more documents, more careful work. But something had shifted in the room that day that had not been there before, and everyone present could feel it. Lyra felt it too. On an evening near the end of the 4th week after the presentation, she found Cole standing at the viewport in the advisory wing corridor, looking out at the open space beyond the station's docking ring. The station's day cycle had shifted to its late amber light, the kind that made the metal walls look warmer than they were. A supply transport was making its slow way out past the docking arms, its running lights blinking in the patient dark. Lyra stopped beside him. They stood there for a moment without speaking, which had become a comfortable thing between them over the past weeks, in a way that Lyra had not noticed developing until it was already there. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure," Cole said. "That first day, when I sat down next to you," she paused, "did you know it was a joke? That my people dared me to do it?" Cole smiled. It was the small private kind that she had learned meant something was genuinely funny to him. "Yeah," he said, "pretty much immediately. And you still showed me the chart." "You were looking at it," he said. Seemed rude not to. By every social standard she had grown up with, Cole had owed that room nothing. He had been ignored for 2 years. He had been the joke at the end of the row. He had every reasonable cause to look away and let her sit in her chosen silence. Instead, he had tilted a paper pad toward a stranger who had not even given him the courtesy of a response, simply because she had been curious and he had noticed. "I think," she said slowly, "that your species is very strange." "Definitely," Cole said, with no argument at all. "I also think," she said, "that this station has wasted a great deal of time." "Probably," he said, "but we have time to make up for it." The supply transport cleared the docking ring and began its long, quiet turn toward open space. The running lights blinked smaller and smaller until they were just part of the stars. Back in Cole's small 3rd-level office, his paper pad was open on the desk, to a fresh page. At the top of the page, in his small, neat handwriting, were the first few lines of Report 48. The 39 reports that had not yet made it into the active review queue were still sitting in the archive system, waiting. There was a lot of work left to do.